In this section of the book, 19.4, we get to talk about community ecology, which I think is my favorite section of this whole book. So, when you think about community ecology, what that means is we're working on this level. So, there's the individual, and then there can be a group of those individuals of the same species called a population. But then, when different species are working together in a place, that's called a community, and that can be plants and animals and fungus, everything working together in an area is called a community. And species really never live in isolation from other populations of species. They're always working together. So the ecological definition of a community is all of the populations of species that live and interact with one another in a shared area. So sometimes these species will actually be ones that kill and eat each other, and that's like a predator-prey relationship, but that's not the only relationship that ends up existing. Earlier in the book, we ended up talking about this chart in the last section where you have the population of hares, which are like a type of rabbit, and then a lynx, which is a cat that eats the rabbits. And as the populations of hares goes up, the populations of the lynx will then go up because there's more prey there. And as it falls down, the lynx will fall down. And then when there's almost no lynx left, the hares will be very successful in surviving. But shortly after they start to take off, more and more lynx are able to survive, and they work out this predator-prey relationships. So those that are best able to survive and are good at evading a predator will be the ones that survive and pass on their gene as a heritable characteristic. So it's not just animals that defend themselves. Most creatures have a defense mechanism. So here's different plants. And on these plants, what do you see? Well, I see some thorns, and these flowers are called foxglove. They actually have a toxin in them that will get, like if they're eaten, they will make you very sick, if not death. And so different plants even have ways to defend themselves. But defending yourself just through having sharp points or a thick skin or a poison isn't the only way. You can actually also have camouflage. So I have a picture of, I'm bringing up the wrong thing. So here's a picture of the monarch butterfly, and it's monarch butterflies with milkweeds. And monarch butterflies can only lay their babies on milkweeds. That's the only plant that they will lay their babies on. And their babies will actually eat, the larva will eat the milkweed and basically keep the toxins from the milkweed in its body, even as it metamorphosizes into a full-grown butterfly. So it's interesting, and then it's got these bright orange colors to show that it is dangerous to other organisms. So here's some camouflaged organisms. This is a great walking stick here, or here's like a chameleon that's kind of hidden. I don't think it's the best hiding. Here's another example of warning coloration where they are warning other organisms to not eat them. This is interesting because this is a picture of a wasp, but this is a fly. So this fly, you can see that, well, I'm not sure if you can see it in this picture, but wasps and bees belong to Hymenoptera, meaning they have a second set of wings. And you can see clearly that this one does not, although these wings are hard to see in here. But flies, this fly very effectively looks like a bee, and a lot of times you'll look at tiny little flies that are around in your area, and they maybe look like bees or have a bee print on them, and they're mimicking something that's poisonous, even though this one is totally harmless. Here's various butterflies that have basically evolved to have similar coloring, though some of them are completely fine and some of them are poisonous. So here's different organisms. Like if you just, I just googled camouflaged animals, and it's just so interesting when you find them. You know, look at this right here, or this right here, this different caterpillar. It's just so interesting how well these animals can hide. Like here's one, and remain hidden. It's just great a way to blend in. So there's something called the competitive exclusion principle, and this is an important principle in your book. And that is that sometimes an organism can live alone on its own and be totally fine on its own. But when the two are together, they compete for the same resources, and one of them is better adapted and one of them is not as well adapted, and it will lead to one of them going extinct, hence exclusion, competitive exclusion. It's totally excluded. And so the example they gave here was two different paramecium that are living in the same place. Okay, another way that organisms can live together is in symbiotic relationship. So symbiotic just means that there is a relationship there and there is a close interaction, but it doesn't mean that one benefits using symbiosis. I hear some people say that incorrectly, so I just want to clear that up. Symbiosis just means that there is a relationship present. So the different types of relationships you can have is like a commensalism type of relationship. Some people have argued that kind of nothing is totally commensalism. In fact, when I Googled commensalism for good examples, they gave a lot of incorrect examples. And people upload stuff to the internet, so it's not that Google's wrong, but a lot of people uploading things were wrong. So commensalism is when one species benefits and one gets nothing out of it. It's not helped or hurt, it's just literally nothing. So this is a picture of called a weaver bird, and this is a masked weaver, and these birds go and build like these upside down nests in trees, and I believe it's usually like acacia like trees with big thorns. And so the bird is benefiting from this very thorny tree, but the acacia isn't really helped or hurt. This is where some people argue that that's not ever really true, because that tree now can't put leaves there, or that tree, if it had leaves, it can't photosynthesize there, or it does have to carry the weight of this bird. So is it truly not helped or hurt? Maybe the bird leaves feces and dung that helps fertilize the tree, so is it being helped? So commensalism examples are really hard to find, but it's where one is benefiting and the other the other one is not being helped or hurt. Another example that was an okay-ish example is like this whale with barnacles all over it. So there's different baleen whales that filter feed, and the barnacles will catch a ride and live on the whale forever and throughout their lives. And is this whale really not being helped or hurt by this? I wouldn't want this scaliness all over me, but I don't know. So this is an example of okay-ish commensalism. It's basically one of the things that's harder to find. Okay, so mutualism is when both of the organisms benefit from the relationship. So two things benefit, and there's a lot of examples where you can find this, that two organisms both benefit. So inside of the human gut, we have different bacteria, and the bacteria will live off of the food. In fact, it's been estimated that a massive portion of your body weight is actually just the bacteria that are helping you out, that are living symbiotically inside of you. And those bacteria, as they digest food, they'll actually give you nutrients. So it is a beneficial relationship to both. Parasitism is a little bit easier to find. So parasitism is where one organism is benefiting and the other one is actually being harmed. And so some people might argue that this is parasitism. Okay, so it's just something to think about. It's not going to be, oh, it'll be obvious if that's ever a test question. But for parasitism, one of the examples that I always think about that from working in the Great Barrier Reef is actually the sea cucumber and the pearlfish. So the sea cucumber and the pearlfish, there is a fish that I learned about in the Great Barrier Reef called the pearlfish. And the story that was told to me is that at the aquarium, they had put a few sea cucumbers in a bucket, and next time they checked on them later, a while later, there was pearlfish swimming around in the bucket. Where did the pearlfish come from? Well, the pearlfish, they found out as they looked into it, the pearlfish is a type of fish that actually swims into the anus of a sea cucumber. So like here's one living inside of the anus of a sea cucumber. And it uses the sea cucumber for protection. It will actually eat the sex organs in some cases of the sea cucumber, so the gonads of the sea cucumber, and will sometimes mate and like lay eggs inside of the sea cucumber. So it's a horrible process for the sea cucumber. And so this was what I would call parasitic. Okay, so moving on to the next part. So biodiversity is measured in a number of ways. So biodiversity is how many organisms of a certain kind exist in an area, and you can measure that a few different ways. So species richness is specifically the number of species living in a habitat, in a certain habitat. So if you took your front lawn and counted up how many species were there altogether, that would be species richness. Now species abundance is how many of each of those kinds of species live there. So if I'm looking at my front lawn, the large majority of the lawn is going to be just one type of grass, and then probably a large number of ants, and then maybe just a few of other organisms. But dandelions, there's going to be a couple of those. There's going to be 0 trees. And so abundance is how many, if you had to count how many of each are there, it would be a ton of ants, I know, for my yard. So that's richness, is the total number of different kinds of species, if you had to list every species name. And then abundance is if you did a count on each of those. Island biogeography is something that's really interesting, where it looks at different islands that they have isolated and looked at species richness versus the size of the island and how far it is from the mainland. Excuse me. And then, so obviously, in island biogeography, the closer you are to another piece of land and the larger the island, you tend to have more biodiversity. So this is a picture of North and South America, and the number of, like, the species richness, how many types of species are in an area. And you can see that it is just a hot spot in the northern part of South America, and then Central America too, that these areas really deserve a good look and preservation. And no shocker, where it's completely frozen, there's not very many species. Okay, so a foundation species is a species that is very important to an area, and without that species being there, that's really what makes up the area and makes it unique and different. So I was thinking with that that the first thing that came to mind is like a pine forest. In a pine forest, obviously, pine trees are the main foundation species. You have to have the pine trees or you don't really have a pine forest anymore. You can also think about that in our ocean in California, that we have kelp forests. And kelp forests are the foundation species for that area, and it provides a place for sharks to rest and sea lions, and there's babies of different fish that swim around. So it's kind of like a nursery, and it's really important to have. So an interesting species that's there, or another species I want to tell you about, is called a keystone species. And a keystone species is one that if you did not have that species, they're just very important for maintaining biodiversity and the biological community. If you didn't have them, the community starts to collapse. So something that came to mind in our California oceans was the sea stars. Sea stars were harvested heavily, 100 years ago or so. And once that happened, this purple sea urchins, which you can see very commonly on our coast, started to really flourish. Well, sea urchins, what they do is they go and they grab, you can see it here, they grab onto the bottom of the kelp called the holdfast, and you can see that here. And they will go and they'll just eat the base of the holdfast, and it will break it off, and it floats to the top, and it comes in on the beach as just this broken off piece of kelp. And when the sea stars were being over harvested, these guys started to grow out of control, and they started killing all of the kelp forests. Well, without the kelp forest, there wasn't a place for the baby fish to grow, and there wasn't that safe nursery place, and a lot of migrating fish were not having their babies there. So our fishing went way, way down. So some different means were taken to get rid of these. In fact, another problem with these is back here with sea otters. We used to have all kinds of sea otters in Southern California, and now they're just like in the middle of California. And when they were hunted to extinction, this was an additional problem. So as we've gotten more sea stars back, the sea stars actually will go up and they'll surround an urchin like this. They'll surround an urchin and they'll stick out their whole stomach and get all their acids on the urchin, which dissolves the inside and the hard parts of the urchin, and they will eat the urchin. So here's another one making that happen. And so it helps keep our kelp forests intact. So in community dynamics, we can have environmental disturbances like volcanoes, earthquakes, fires, climate change, human damage, that disturbs or breaks up an ecosystem. So when the ecosystem starts to rebuild, there's a few different types of what's called succession. So the first type of succession is called primary succession. And I'm not in love with this one picture that they brought up here, so I brought up one of my favorite examples, which is Surtsey. Surtsey is an example of primary succession. That means there wasn't anything before, and now the very first pioneer species are going to have to come grow on that place. So Surtsey, in the 1960s, there was a volcanic eruption, and this island was formed, and it came up out of, the volcanic eruption of the 60s. And slowly over time, you can see a little bit of green spots. This is a World Heritage Site, so you're not actually allowed to go there, and it's slowly dissolving back into the ocean, so it'll be gone in probably your lifetime. But it's been a great example to see what pioneer species go there and show up. And now modern day, these are some scientists that are doing some measurements on it. It's starting to get grasses. This was more like some of the primary succession, early succession that was going on. And then now you see more grasses in some of these areas, and some things still have nothing. So as more animals come to visits and birds leave their droppings and different sea lions come to rest and leave their droppings, it's slowly getting some plants on it. And that's called primary succession, when you have to have these pioneer species come in. So secondary succession is different. Secondary succession is when there was already plants and soil and things like that, but something came through, like maybe tractors came and mowed it down, or people logged in that area, or there was a massive fire, but there's still soil, and the organisms that were there before left their nutrients in the ground for something new to grow. Then you'll get a primary species, then you have something called intermediate species, and then climax community is the final species that will live there in the end. I wanted to show you one more thing in biodiversity. Some people don't know what a biodiversity hotspot is, but a biodiversity hotspot is an area where there's extremely high levels of biodiversity. So you actually, if you live in California, live in one called the California Floristic Province. There's only a few of these in the world, but it's an extremely high level of biodiversity, but it's an area that we've killed. In California, it's about 75% of that biodiversity, of the native plants and animals. And plants is actually, for California Floristic Province, is a really important thing that has died out. So in the United States, we're one of a few that actually have this biodiversity hotspot. And so we really should work to plant and use native plants so that we can help some of them regrow.